The first thing you notice is the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles into bones. A wide stretch of land opens beneath a tired sky, the sun lowering itself without ceremony, spilling amber light across a frontier town that looks older than it should. Wooden buildings lean as if they have grown weary of standing. Dust moves like a living thing here, drifting slowly, touching everything, remembering everyone. This is the West as it truly was. Not loud, not glorious, but enduring. A woman walks alone down the road, her boots worn thin, her shoulders slightly rounded, not from weakness, but from years of carrying what could not be set down. The wind lifts the hem of her skirt, gentle as a hand that almost remembers kindness. She keeps her eyes lowered, not because she is ashamed, but because the ground has taught her how to listen. If you listen closely, you can hear the stories beneath her steps. They never carved statues for women like her. They never wrote ballads about the way her hands bled quietly at dawn, or how she learned to swallow grief before breakfast and keep working until nightfall. History made room for guns and gamblers, for men whose names sounded better shouted than whispered. Women were expected to disappear into the background, like smoke after a fire, necessary, but never admired. The unspeakable horrors were not always loud. Sometimes they were small. Sometimes they were daily. Sometimes they were simply the absence of mercy. She was born with a name that once felt warm in her mouth, spoken by a mother who did not live long enough to see what the world would demand of her daughter. By the time she was grown, the West had already taught her its lessons. Work hard. Speak little. Endure everything. Ask for nothing. Her strength was not forged in moments of triumph. It was shaped in kitchens before sunrise, in fields under burning skies, in nights where loneliness pressed, so close it felt like another body beside her, breathing but never comforting. People in town saw her often, but they never really looked. To them, she was useful, reliable, replaceable, a woman whose worth could be measured in labor and silence. They did not ask who she loved, or what she dreamed of before survival became her only language. There was a time she believed love might arrive like the stories promised. A man, steady and sure, someone who would choose her as if choice itself were sacred. She held that belief carefully, the way one carries water across a desert, knowing any careless movement could spill it. The first man came without cruelty in his voice, which somehow made the wound deeper. He was not a villain. He did not raise his hand or his temper. He simply lacked the courage to look at another human being and truly see them. He wanted comfort without responsibility, companionship without tenderness. When he realized she carried history in her eyes, when he sensed that loving her would require patience and gentleness, he turned away. Rejection does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes quietly, in half-finished sentences and eyes that slide past you as if you were furniture. Sometimes it comes in the way a person chooses themselves without ever considering the cost to you. She did not beg. She did not break. But something folded inward that day, something that had once hoped too easily. She learned then what many women of the West learned early, that being needed was not the same as being cherished, that a woman could give her whole life to survival and still be considered inconvenient. The town continued as towns always do. A shopkeeper who nodded but never asked how she fared. A preacher who spoke of endurance as virtue but never noticed who endured the most. An older woman with eyes like weathered stone, who once whispered that youth disappears faster out here, as if the land itself consumes it. There was a child, too, small and curious, who followed her sometimes, asking questions that had not yet learned fear. In the child's laughter, she heard echoes of herself before the world taught her to quiet her voice. She smiled more around that child than she realized, as if some part of her still recognized innocence when it passed by. At night, she returned to her small room, lit by a single lamp that flickered as though uncertain it should stay. She washed her hands slowly, watching the water darken with dust and labor. She stared at her reflection not with vanity, but with study, like someone trying to remember a face from a dream. The unspeakable horrors did not always leave scars you could point to. They lived in the way women learned to make themselves smaller, in the way their grief was expected to be private, in the way their strength was praised only when it benefited others. Outside, the wind moved through the town again, brushing against doors and windows, carrying stories it would never repeat the same way twice. Somewhere nearby, laughter rose and fell, sharp and fleeting. She listened without envy, only with a distant curiosity, like someone remembering a language they once spoke fluently. She wondered sometimes if surviving was all life intended for her. The thought scared her more than hunger ever had. Still, she rose every morning. Still, she worked. Still, she offered kindness where she could, though the world rarely returned it. There was something in her that refused to harden completely, no matter how often the land tried to shape her into stone. On this evening, as the sun finally disappeared behind the hills, she stopped walking and stood very still. The lanterns began to glow one by one, small pockets of light fighting back the dark. She held her breath, not because she expected something to change, but because for a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight she had been carrying. Not just her own, but the weight of women before her. Women whose names were never recorded. Women who endured quietly so others could call the West brave. She did not know yet that her story had more chapters. She did not know that kindness, when it finally arrived, would do so without demands or declarations. All she knew was this simple truth, resting heavy and honest in her chest. Survival had kept her alive, but it had not yet taught her how to live. The wind passed again, softer this time, almost respectful. The lantern light trembled, then steadied. She lifted her head just enough to look at the road ahead, long and uncertain, stretching far beyond the edge of town. And for the first time in a long while, she did not turn away from it. The West had taken much from her already, but it had not taken everything. Not yet. Morning comes without tenderness in the West. It arrives pale and practical, pressing itself against the edges of the town as if to say there is work to be done and little time to feel about it. She wakes before the light fully settles, the room still cool, the air holding onto the night's last breath. For a moment, she lies still, listening. The creak of wood somewhere nearby, a horse shifting its weight, the distant sound of a door opening, then closing again. Life moving forward whether one is ready or not. She rises because she always does. Her days are stitched together by small, uncelebrated acts. Carrying water, scrubbing floors, mending what others have worn thin, feeding mouths that never ask who fed hers. This is how women survive out here. By making themselves useful enough to be tolerated. By learning which pains to hide and which to accept as permanent. No one calls it cruelty. They call it necessity. The West has a way of teaching women that endurance is their greatest virtue, while quietly ensuring it is also their greatest burden. Pain is expected. Fatigue is assumed. Gratitude is demanded even when mercy is scarce. She has learned how to keep her voice gentle, even when her chest feels tight. She has learned how to smile without inviting questions. She has learned that silence can be a form of armor, though it grows heavy when worn too long. There are stories whispered between women when no one else is listening. Stories that do not ask for sympathy, only understanding. A woman who vanished after a winter too harsh for hope. Another who stayed because leaving required resources she did not possess. Names spoken once, then folded away like letters too painful to reread. In the eyes of an older woman she sometimes meets at the well, she sees recognition. A shared knowing that crosses generations without needing words. That woman's hands tremble slightly when she draws water, not from age alone, but from years of bracing herself against a world that never softened. The preacher's wife passes by often, her posture perfect, her smile practiced. She speaks of blessings and patience, her voice sweet as molasses. But when their eyes meet, something flickers. A tired truth, a longing unfulfilled, the kind of loneliness that exists even in crowded rooms. These women survive. That is their crime and their triumph. The heroine moves through her days carrying all of this quietly, storing it in the careful places inside herself where grief does not spill too loudly. She does not dramatize her suffering. She has no energy for spectacle. Survival has taught her efficiency, not expression. And yet, some days, the weight presses harder than others. On one such afternoon, as the sun hangs high and unforgiving, she pauses longer than necessary at her work. Not because her body refuses, but because her spirit hesitates. She watches dust swirl in the light, tiny particles dancing as if they have nowhere urgent to be. She envies them, briefly, their freedom to drift without consequence. It is then that she notices him, not arriving, not announcing himself, simply there. He works nearby, steady and unremarkable the most. His movements are unhurried, deliberate. He does not command attention, and he does not seek it. When others speak, he listens. When silence falls, he does not rush to fill it. Their eyes meet only briefly, and in that moment, nothing dramatic occurs. No spark, no revelation, just the absence of judgment, the absence of hunger, the quiet recognition of another human being occupying the same difficult world. She looked away first, not from fear but from habit. Men have learned to look at her in ways that take more than they give. She has learned to guard herself accordingly. Hope, she knows, can be dangerous. It asks questions survival does not have time to answer. He does not pursue conversation. He does not insert himself into her space. He offers no compliments, no expectations. He treats her as though her presence is neither an inconvenience nor an opportunity. This unsettles her more than attention ever did. Days pass, weeks. Their lives overlap in small, almost invisible ways. A shared task completed without commentary. A door held without flourish. A nod that acknowledges effort rather than ownership. These moments are so minor they might go unnoticed by anyone looking for grand gestures. But she notices, because kindness that asks for nothing feels foreign to someone who has always paid for it in advance. At night, she returns to her room more tired than before, not from labor, but from the quiet conflict stirring inside her. She tells herself not to imagine things, not to misinterpret decency as something more. The West has taught her caution too well for foolish dreams. She remembers the first man, how easily she had believed in the shape of what could be, how quickly that belief was dismissed. She carries that lesson like a bruise that never quite fades. Around her, the town continues its steady rhythm. Children run and fall and rise again. Men speak loudly of plans that rarely include anyone but themselves. Women move like currents beneath the surface, shaping everything while being credited for nothing. One evening, she hears of another woman leaving. Not by choice exactly. Circumstance, they say, as if circumstance were not just another name for neglect. The news settles in her chest, heavy and familiar. She wonders how many more stories will pass through this place without ever being held. She sits outside her room that night, watching the sky darken. Stars appear slowly, patiently, as if they understand that light must be earned here. The air is cooler now, carrying the scent of dry earth and something faintly hopeful. He passes by then, unhurried as always. He nods, a simple acknowledgement. He does not linger, but neither does he ignore her. The moment stretches just long enough to feel intentional. For reasons she does not yet understand, she feels safer in that moment than she has in a long time. It frightens her, because safety suggests rest, and rest suggests trust, and trust is something the West has taught her to ration carefully. She turns inward again, reminding herself of all she has endured, of how easily tenderness can become liability, of how often women are asked to carry hope alone and blamed when it breaks. Still, something shifts, not loudly, not completely, just enough to make the silence feel different. She lies awake that night, longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to the town settle into sleep. Her body aches in familiar ways, but her mind wanders to unfamiliar places. She imagines what it might feel like to be seen without explanation, to be valued without performance. The thought feels almost dangerous. So she pushes it aside and closes her eyes. Outside, the wind moves through the streets again, quieter than before, brushing against walls and fences as if memorizing their shapes. It carries with it the stories of women who survived by becoming invisible, and those who disappeared despite their best efforts. The West remains unchanged, harsh, demanding, unforgiving, but within her, something small resists being worn down completely. A question barely formed, a possibility she refuses to name yet. Kindness has appeared at the edge of her life, unannounced, unclaimed, and though she does not trust it, she does not turn away. Not this time. The mornings grew softer, though the West itself remained unyielding. Sunlight still struck the streets harshly, dust still coated everything in its dry memory, but something subtle had shifted. A gentle rhythm began to thread itself through her days, almost imperceptible, like a whisper moving behind a door, or a song remembered from childhood. It began in small gestures. The quiet man, he had never introduced himself properly, had never intruded, had never asked for more than she could give, would leave her a cup of water at the well, untouched by anyone else, still cool in the early morning heat. He did not watch for thanks, did not linger to comment. His presence was steady, unassuming, and patient. She noticed. It was the first time in years that someone had done something simply to ease a day, not to claim a piece of her, not to weigh her down with expectation. It was not romantic. It was not calculated. It was a kind of trust offered without demand, a space for her to breathe she had almost forgotten existed. Day by day, the small openings of light grew. She began to speak again, in whispers first, as though testing whether the world still listened. Words floated from her lips more freely, small observations about the wind, the weather, the stubbornness of the horses. He did not reply immediately with grand speeches. He listened. He allowed her thoughts to settle in his quiet attention. That in itself felt revolutionary. There were other women, too. The older woman at the well smiled in a way that carried relief. Not because she had hope herself, but because she had seen its return in another. The child followed a little closer, not out of need, but curiosity, sensing that some boundaries could now be gentle, not sharp. The work of survival still demanded much, but it no longer felt like the sole measure of her worth. She could be seen without having to prove anything. She could rest, even briefly, without fear. The West had not softened. It remained harsh and demanding. But inside her, something else was growing. A fragile bloom of trust, tender and careful, like a sprout pushing through cracked earth. And then, the first unguarded laugh. It escaped quietly as she watched a young colt struggle to rise, flailing clumsily in the dirt, and then shake itself upright. It was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it startled her with its lightness. And he, standing nearby, smiled, not in mockery, not in possession, but in recognition of the small wonder she allowed herself to feel. It was not love as it is often spoken of in stories. It was something older, steadier, safety. She began to allow herself to imagine, not the sweeping romances of books and songs, but a life in which she could set down her armor, if only for a moment, without it being taken from her. Sometimes, when she worked beside him, he would hand her a tool without asking or refill her water before she noticed it was empty. She looked at him in those moments, surprised by the absence of demand. She wanted to ask why, but feared that even a question might break the delicate balance of trust she had begun to feel. She noticed the way he listened, not only to her words, but to the spaces between them. Not to fill them, not to correct them, not to judge, but to witness, to be present. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to hope. Hope was dangerous. She remembered all too well what hope could do in a world that demanded endurance and silence. It could blossom too quickly, then be trampled. It could open a heart to expectation and then leave it empty. Yet this hope was different. It asked nothing. It only offered the possibility that some things could be gentle, that some people could be kind without strings attached. Even so, she did not allow herself to trust fully. She observed quietly, testing, waiting. She remembered the first man, how he had promised little, yet taken everything. But small acts continued to accumulate, like raindrops filling a dry creek bed. And, slowly, the weight inside her began to shift. The burden she had carried for years did not disappear, but it grew lighter, because someone else's presence had begun to acknowledge it, to hold space for it, without judgment. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, she stood watching the horizon, and he approached silently. No fanfare, no speech. He simply handed her a small bundle of cloth, neatly folded, the smell of lavender faint in the folds. It was not his job. It was not a favor. It was kindness, simple and complete. She took it without speaking, her hands trembling not from weakness, but from recognition. Recognition of something long denied. Someone had seen her. Not the surface she presented to survive. Not the function she performed for others. But the whole, fragile, complicated self that had endured so much. For the first time in years, she felt a little unbroken. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind moving across the town, thinking of the years she had endured alone. She did not dwell on pain. She did not dwell on loss. She thought only of small, luminous moments, a nod, a silent gesture, a shared laugh, each one like a candle flickering in the dark corners of her memory. And she allowed herself to imagine a future in which she could laugh more freely, speak more fully, and live more fully. The second man did not demand anything of her. He did not ask her to explain her past or to prove herself. He simply existed beside her, steady, present, gentle, and she, slowly, began to understand that trust, like survival, is learned. And perhaps, for the first time, she was learning it not out of necessity, but out of possibility. The child, who often lingered nearby, seemed to sense the change. She no longer moved with caution around the heroine, as though understanding that the tension she had carried, like a second skin, was softening. And the older woman, seeing her laughter bloom, smiled with quiet relief, as though the world had remembered its promise through her. The West was still cruel. The land remained harsh. The wind still swept dust into every corner. But inside her, a new rhythm had begun. A rhythm that pulsed quietly, steadily, without urgency, without demand. It was the rhythm of being seen, of being accepted, of being safe, even if only in small, fleeting moments. And slowly, very slowly, she began to believe that perhaps she could survive without hiding entirely. That perhaps she could let someone witness her whole self, and it would not be taken. That perhaps there was a place in the world for kindness, even here, even now. The horizon beyond the hills glowed with the last traces of light. She stood beside him, not needing to speak, not needing to move. And for the first time in years, she felt something like peace. The West had taken much, as it always did. But for a fleeting, luminous moment, it had taken nothing from her spirit. And that was enough. The wind carried a sharper chill that evening, as if the West itself was reminding her that it had never softened, never forgiven, and never forgotten. Yet she walked through the streets with a steadiness that surprised her. The burdens of the past were still there, etched into her hands, into the lines of her face, into the quiet places of her chest. But they no longer dictated every step. She passed the empty storefronts, their boards weathered and cracked, and felt the echo of every woman who had come before her. Women who had whispered dreams and seen them swallowed by dust. Women whose voices had been erased by survival. She carried their memory gently, not as shame, but as reverence. The town seemed different now, not brighter, not kinder, but she noticed more. The way a child paused to watch the sunset. The way an old horse stood patient in the corral. Even the wind seemed to move more attentively, as though acknowledging her presence, as though finally understanding she had endured enough to deserve witness. And then came the moment she had unknowingly been preparing for all her life. A confrontation, subtle at first, not with guns or shouts, but with truth. A new development in the town, a dispute, a threat, a reckoning long overdue, demanded courage of a type she had long avoided. A situation that required someone to speak, to act, to assert that endurance alone was not enough. Her first instinct was hesitation. Survival had taught her that silence was safer, that safety often demanded invisibility, that speaking up could invite danger. But she found herself standing taller than she had in years, feeling the steady weight of someone beside her. Not in front to lead, not behind to protect, but beside, equal in presence. He had been quiet all this time, yes. Observing, listening, waiting. And now, in the shadowed tension of that moment, his steadiness became a kind of armor. Not one that replaced her courage, but one that reinforced it. She did not need him to fight her battles. She needed only to know he believed in the possibility of her strength. And so she spoke. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but with certainty. Words shaped by years of endurance, tempered by pain, softened by care. Words that acknowledged injustice, demanded dignity, and reminded the town, and herself, that the cost of silence had been too high for too long. The people listened, some surprised, some uncomfortable, some moved. And she noticed, too, that she no longer feared their judgment as she once had. There was no need to shrink herself to fit their expectations. She had endured the harshest measure of all, invisibility. Now she claimed her presence simply by existing fully, unafraid. The second man, ever quiet, offered only a nod. No words, no interference, just presence. And in that silent support, she felt something like home for the first time. The knowledge that she could stand in truth, fully herself, without being alone. The tension that had been building through the town seemed to dissolve, not in theatrics, but in recognition. Some saw her strength and understood. Others, perhaps, would never understand, but that no longer mattered. The measure of her life would no longer be dictated by those unwilling to see it. As night fell, the horizon burned with color, soft orange, deep purple, fading into the velvet black of stars. The world outside remained indifferent, vast, unyielding. But inside her, the air had shifted. The weight she had carried for years was lighter now, not because the West had softened, but because she had finally recognized her own resilience. And beside her he walked, not ahead, not behind, but perfectly aligned, sharing the silence and the strength of the moment. The child who had followed her in earlier years ran past, chasing something simple and joyous. The older woman at the well watched from a distance, her eyes glistening with pride and relief. These small witnesses, these quiet affirmations of life, were enough to remind her that her survival had meaning beyond endurance. She thought of all the women who had endured before her, all the stories that had been erased, all the small, unseen acts of bravery that had kept humanity alive even in a cruel land. And she realized that the West, for all its cruelty, had failed in one thing. It could not take the spirit that refused to be diminished. Love had arrived quietly, gently, patiently, not as a rescue, not as a reward, not as a cure for past pain, but as acknowledgement, as witness, as respect. And in its presence, she found the courage to fully embrace life again. Her gaze fell upon the second man, steady and calm, and she allowed herself a small, unspoken gratitude. It was not dependence, not surrender, not obligation. It was recognition that kindness, when it arrives without demand, can become a kind of sanctuary even in a world built to deny it. And in that realization, the climax of her story was not a gunfight or a dramatic escape. It was something quieter, infinitely more satisfying, the reclaiming of herself. The claim that her life, her choices, her heart belonged to no one but her, and yet could be shared safely with those who saw her without judgment. The West would continue to be harsh. Winds would still carry dust into every corner. The sun would still scorch and the nights would still bite. But she had discovered a truth the land could not touch. Her spirit, her heart, her capacity for love and courage remained entirely her own. As she walked toward the edge of town with him by her side, the stars above seemed to shimmer a little brighter. And in that quiet, luminous moment, she understood survival had been only the first chapter. Living fully, tenderly, and with courage had only just begun. And so she moved forward, not into perfection, not into a world that had suddenly grown kind, but into a life reclaimed, one step at a time, carrying both past and hope as companions. The horizon stretched endless before them, not a promise of ease, but a promise of choice. And for the first time in a long time, she believed she could meet the West on her own terms, gentle and unbroken, brave and seen. And to you, watching, listening, remembering, the world can be harsh, yes. It can demand endurance. But remember this, even when survival has shaped you, even when the winds have tried to erode your spirit, there are moments, small and luminous, where kindness finds you. And in those moments, you are allowed to be whole. For where are you watching today? Take a breath. Let these stories remind you of the strength in your quiet endurance, the power in your patience, and the beauty in gentleness. Like, comment, subscribe, and carry these stories forward, for you may be the witness someone has been waiting for. The West may take much, but it can never take the courage to be tender. The West may claim dust, blood, hardship, but the heart that refuses to shrink remains unbroken, luminous, eternal.